December 1944 merged seamlessly with chaos as Nurse Greta Hoffmann pressed her trembling hands against the stone walls of Camp Papago Park in Arizona. The desert sun bore down mercilessly on the makeshift prisoner of war facility, where she and 43 other German nurses had been transferred after their capture in North Africa. They had arrived expecting primitive conditions, perhaps tents, crude surgical tools, and the bare minimum of medical supplies that wars typically allowed. What they encountered instead would shatter every assumption they held about American capabilities. Greta's first morning began with a summons to the camp's medical facility. Walking through the compound with fellow nurses Elsie Richter and Marguerite Schaefer, she noticed the strange cleanliness of everything. The paths were swept. The buildings, though temporary, showed meticulous maintenance. But nothing prepared them for what lay beyond the infirmary doors. "Wie ist das überhaupt möglich?" Elsie whispered, her voice barely audible. How is this even possible? The surgical theater gleamed under electric lights, not the flickering, unreliable bulbs they had grown accustomed to in field hospitals across France and North Africa, but steady, bright illumination that seemed almost theatrical in its intensity. Stainless steel instruments lay arranged on trays with military precision. Glass cabinets lined one wall, stocked with medications whose abundance seemed almost wasteful. Greta recognized sulfa drugs, morphine, and plasma supplies that had become mythically scarce in the German medical corps by 1943. An American medical officer, Captain Robert Morrison, observed their stunned silence with professional detachment. He was a tall man with sandy hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen too much suffering in too short a time. "You'll be assisting our medical staff," he explained in competent, if heavily accented German. "We have approximately 8,000 posts in this facility and several others nearby. Medical care is provided according to the Geneva Convention." Marguerite, who had served in a Luftwaffe hospital in Berlin before her deployment, couldn't contain her disbelief. "This is for prisoners?" Her voice carried the weight of bitter comparison. She remembered the overcrowded wards back home, where 3 men often shared beds designed for one, where bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart, where penicillin was so rare that doctors literally had to choose who would live and who would die. According to a detailed account published in the Journal of Military Medicine in 1946, German medical personnel consistently expressed shock at the resource disparity they witnessed in American facilities. The article documented numerous interviews with captured medical staff, noting their genuine bewilderment at what they perceived as excessive provision of care. Captain Morrison led them through the facility. The pharmacy contained medications they recognized only from pre-war medical textbooks. Whole blood for transfusions was stored in refrigeration units technology Greta had only heard about in lectures at the Charité Hospital in Berlin, where she had trained in the 1930s. The X-ray department housed equipment that looked brand new, not the aging, temperamental machines she had coaxed into function during her last posting in Tunisia. "We receive supply shipments weekly," Morrison mentioned casually. As though this were the most natural thing in the world. Weekly, Greta exchanged glances with Elsie, in the German medical service. They had sometimes gone months without proper supplies. She thought of the boys because that's what they had been. Really, boys barely old enough to shave who had died from infections that sulfa drugs could have prevented, if only they had possessed more than a handful of packets to distribute among hundreds of wounded. The tour continued into the recovery ward, where injured prisoners recuperated in individual beds with clean white linens. Each bed had a chart, meticulously maintained. Nurses moved efficiently between patients, checking vitals, administering medications, adjusting 4 drips. The intravenous therapy itself was remarkable. Greta had learned the technique, but in German field hospitals, the equipment was so scarce that it was reserved only for the most critical cases. One prisoner, a young Wehrmacht soldier named Klaus Berger, who had been captured in Italy, lay recovering from an appendectomy. His surgical wound was clean, properly sutured, showing no signs of infection. Marguerite examined his chart with professional interest, noting the detailed post-operative care instructions, the scheduled antibiotic regimen, the nutritional plan designed to promote healing. "In Stalingrad," Marguerite said quietly, speaking to no one in particular, We performed amputations without anesthesia. We ran out in January of 1943. Her voice carried no self-pity, only the flat tone of someone stating an immutable fact. Men bit down on leather straps while we sawed through bone. The second week of January 1945 brought a sandstorm that turned the Arizona sky amber and forced everyone indoors. Greta found herself working alongside American nurses in the surgical unit, and the cultural exchange proved as disorienting as the medical one. The American women were professional, certainly, but they possessed a casualness that seemed almost inappropriate given the gravity of their work. They chatted while preparing surgical instruments. They smiled at patients. They made jokes during their breaks. Nurse Patricia O'Connor, a redhead from Boston with freckles across her nose, attempted conversation during a lull between procedures. "You trained in Berlin?" she asked, her German halting but earnest. "My cousin studied there before the war." Said it was beautiful. Greta nodded stiffly, unsure how to navigate this strange social territory. In the German medical system, hierarchy was absolute. Nurses did not casually converse with prisoners, and certainly not with enemy prisoners. Yet here, the Americans seemed to make no significant distinction. Medical care was medical care, administered with the same attention whether the patient wore American or German uniform. The philosophical difference became startlingly apparent when a group of wounded prisoners arrived from a work detail accident. A truck had overturned, and 6 men had sustained various injuries, fractures, lacerations, one severe head trauma. The American medical team mobilized with practiced efficiency, triaging patients, establishing treatment priorities, moving with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Captain Morrison personally attended to the head trauma case, a corporal named Heinrich Vogel. The injury was severe depressed skull fracture, likely brain involvement. In Greta's experience, such cases were often deemed hopeless, especially for prisoners. Resources went to those who could return to duty or, in the case of POWs, whose survival seemed most likely without extensive intervention. But Morrison didn't hesitate. "Prepare for surgery," he ordered. "I want X-rays immediately, whole blood standing by, and get me the cranial surgery kit." Elsie assisted in the procedure, and what she witnessed left her speechless for days afterward. Morrison performed a craniotomy with remarkable skill, relieving the pressure on Vogel's brain, repairing damaged vessels, closing with meticulous care. The surgery lasted 4 hours. The equipment, the assistants, the post-operative care plan, all of it was executed as though Vogel were Morrison's own brother rather than an enemy combatant. "He'll likely survive," Morrison told Greta afterward, washing his hands in the scrub sink. "Might have some neurological deficits, but the prognosis is reasonably good." Greta stared at him, searching for signs of irony or jest. Finding none, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since her arrival. Why? Why expend such resources on prisoners? Morrison turned, drying his hands methodically. His expression was difficult to read, part surprise, part something that might have been pity. "Because they're human beings," he said simply. "Because we have the means to help, and because the war won't last forever. When it ends, these men will return home. What would it say about us if we let them die when we could prevent it?" The concept was revolutionary to Greta. She had been trained in a system where medical resources were weapons, to be deployed strategically for maximum military advantage. The Nazis had taken this philosophy to its horrifying extreme, of course, but even before the war, even in the Weimar Republic when she had begun her training, efficiency and triage had been paramount. You saved those who mattered most to the state. Marguerite struggled with similar cognitive dissonance. She had been assigned to the pharmacy where she inventoried supplies that seemed almost obscenely abundant. Bottles of aspirin in quantities that could supply a German field hospital for months. Morphine syrettes by the thousands. Sulfanilamide powder, penicillin, the latter being so new that Marguerite had only read about it in captured British medical journals. "They have a drug," she told Greta one evening as they sat in their barracks, called penicillin. "From mold, it kills bacteria that sulfa drugs cannot touch. Captain Morrison says production began only last year, but already they have enough to treat everyone who needs it." The implications were staggering. Greta thought of the sepsis cases she had watched die slowly, painfully, despite her best efforts. Young men whose wounds had become infected, whose fevers had climbed until they became delirious, who had died calling for mothers they would never see again. How many could have been saved with access to such medication? Mid-February 1945 arrived with unseasonable warmth, and with it came an invitation that would fundamentally alter the German nurse's understanding of modern medicine. Dr. Samuel Weinstein, the camp's chief medical officer, requested that the nursing staff, both American and German, attend a training session on new medical procedures and technologies. For the Americans, it was routine continuing education. For the Germans, it was a journey into what felt like science fiction. The training took place in a dedicated education building that had been erected specifically for medical instruction. Greta, Elsie, and Marguerite entered with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, taking seats near the back of the room. Charts covered the walls, detailed anatomical diagrams, procedural flowcharts, pharmaceutical reference guides. A projector had been set up, ready to display photographic slides. Dr. Weinstein was a compact man in his early 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the patient demeanor of a born teacher. He had emigrated from Vienna in 1933, one step ahead of the rising Nazi tide, and his German carried the distinctive accent of educated Austrians. This linguistic bridge made him particularly effective at communicating with the German medical staff. Today we will discuss advances in trauma surgery and antimicrobial therapy, he began, adjusting his spectacles. The past 3 years have seen extraordinary progress, driven largely by military necessity. What we have learned is being systematically documented for post-war implementation. The first slide showed a surgical procedure that made Marguerite lean forward, squinting in disbelief. It depicted a thoracotomy chest surgery being performed in a field hospital setting. The level of sophistication was remarkable. Proper anesthesia equipment, blood transfusion apparatus, surgical instruments that gleamed even in the grainy photograph. This procedure was performed in a Mogul surgical hospital in France, September 1944, Weinstein explained. The patient, a sergeant with shrapnel penetration of the left lung, survived. He returned to duty 3 months later. In German military medicine, such an injury would typically have been fatal. Chest wounds were notorious killers, and attempting surgery in field conditions was generally considered futile. You made the patient comfortable and waited for the inevitable. The idea that not only could such surgery be performed successfully, but that it could be done routinely enough to warrant training sessions, seemed to violate everything Greta had learned about wartime medical limitations. The presentation continued with a detailed explanation of blood banking. Dr. Weinstein described a sophisticated system of collection, testing, typing, storage, and distribution that ensured whole blood and plasma were available wherever needed. Charts showed the logistics: refrigerated trucks, standardized storage containers, testing protocols that prevented mismatched transfusions. The development of citrate phosphate dextrose solution as an anticoagulant has revolutionized blood storage. Weinstein explained, his enthusiasm evident. We can now preserve blood for up to 21 days. Combined with our typing and cross-matching protocols, transfusion reactions have decreased by approximately 70% since 1941. Elsie raised her hand hesitantly. Weinstein nodded encouragement. Dr. Weinstein, what is the scale of this system? How many units are maintained? The American Red Cross coordinates collection domestically, he replied. Current estimates suggest we're processing approximately 6 million units annually for military use alone. Civil hospitals have separate but parallel systems. 6 million units. Annually, the number was incomprehensible. Greta calculated quickly that would be enough to supply every German military hospital she had worked in, fully supplied for years. Yet this was apparently normal operational capacity for the American system. The discussion shifted to antibiotics, and here Dr. Weinstein's enthusiasm became almost evangelistic. He spoke about penicillin with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. In 1943, he said, penicillin was so scarce that we recycled it from patients' urine. Today, we have sufficient quantities that we can use it prophylactically for any significant wound or surgical procedure. The impact on mortality cannot be overstated. He displayed before and after statistics. Mortality from bacterial infections in combat wounds had decreased from approximately 15% in World War I to less than 3% in the current conflict. Gangrene, once nearly inevitable in severe extremity wounds, had become rare. Pneumonia, the feared old man's friend that killed more hospitalized patients than any other complication, could now be cured in days rather than weeks. March 1945 brought with it a case that would crystallize all the paradoxes and contradictions the German nurses had been wrestling with since their arrival. A work detail at a nearby copper mine suffered a collapse, trapping 3 German posts and 2 American guards in a tunnel for nearly 6 hours. When they were finally extracted, all 5 men were in critical condition crush injuries, smoke inhalation, dehydration, shock. The American medical response was immediate and overwhelming. 2 ambulances arrived at Camp Papago Park within 20 minutes. The surgical theater was prepared. Captain Morrison called in a vascular surgeon from the base hospital in Phoenix. Dr. Weinstein coordinated with multiple facilities to ensure adequate blood supplies. The machinery of American military medicine lurched into motion with impressive speed. Greta found herself assisting Morrison with the most severely injured POW, a private named Franz Dietrich from Hamburg. He was perhaps 20 years old, with crush injuries to both legs and internal bleeding that Morrison suspected indicated a ruptured spleen. The young man's blood pressure was dangerously low, his breathing shallow and rapid. In a German field hospital, he would have been made comfortable and left to die. There simply wouldn't have been resources to save him, not with so many others needing care, not with the chronic shortages that defined German military medicine by this stage of the war. But here, Morrison didn't even pause to consider whether treatment was worthwhile. "Type and cross-match for 8 units, he ordered. "Get me a surgical team and notify the vascular specialists that we're going in immediately. This boy doesn't have time for us to wait." The surgery lasted 7 hours. Greta stood as Morrison's primary assistant, handing instruments, maintaining the surgical field, watching with professional fascination as the American doctor performed a splenectomy, repaired a lacerated renal artery, and set compound fractures in both tibias. The vascular specialist, a Major Henderson, who had trained at Johns Hopkins before the war, demonstrated techniques that Greta had only read about in pre-war German medical journals. "The key is maintaining perfusion," Henderson explained as he worked, speaking partly for the benefit of the German nurses who were observing. "Keep blood flowing to the tissues, prevent shock, address bleeding systematically. We have the blood products to do it now. 5 years ago, this boy would have died. Today, his prognosis is actually quite good." Franz Dietrich survived the surgery. He remained in critical condition for 3 days, requiring constant monitoring, multiple additional transfusions, aggressive antibiotic therapy to prevent infection. The amount of medical resources dedicated to this single patient, enemy prisoner, a private of no particular importance or rank, would have supplied a German battalion aid station for weeks. Marguerite, who monitored Dietrich's post-operative recovery, found herself having increasingly philosophical conversations with the American nurses. Patricia O'Connor, the red-headed Bostonian who had first attempted to befriend them, proved particularly willing to engage. "It doesn't seem strange to you?" Marguerite asked one evening as they changed Dietrich's dressings. "Such expense for one person?" Patricia considered the question seriously. "I suppose if you're used to scarcity, plenty might seem wasteful. But see, that's the thing, we're not doing this despite the cost. We're doing it because we can, because we've built systems that make it possible, and because ... She paused, searching for words. "Because when this war ends, everyone's going to have to live together again. How we treat each other now matters." April 1945 descended on the Arizona desert with temperatures that climbed steadily toward summer's brutal heat. But inside the air-conditioned medical facilities of Camp Papago Park, the German nurses continued their education in the vast disparity between American abundance and their own experiences of wartime scarcity. Greta found herself increasingly assigned to the infectious disease ward, where a recent outbreak of respiratory illness among prisoners provided another stark lesson in contrasting medical philosophies. The outbreak began innocuously enough, a few cases of what appeared to be influenza among prisoners housed in Compound 4 in the German military medical system. Such cases would have been isolated if possible, given supportive care, and nature would have taken its course. The weak would die, the strong would recover, and medical resources would be preserved for more acute injuries. It was brutal calculus, but when supplies were limited and needs were infinite, such calculations became necessary. The American response was characteristically different. Dr. Weinstein ordered immediate quarantine protocols, comprehensive testing of all prisoners in the affected compound, prophylactic antibiotic distribution to prevent secondary bacterial infections, and nutritional supplementation to boost immune response. The pharmaceutical expenditure alone would have bankrupted a German field hospital. "We test every case," Weinstein explained to Greta as they reviewed chest X-rays of affected prisoners. "Influenza, yes, but we need to rule out tuberculosis, pneumonia, any other respiratory pathogens. Early identification means early treatment, which means better outcomes and less spread." Greta studied the X-rays, noting the quality of the images. The machine was new, perhaps manufactured within the last year, and it produced remarkably clear pictures. She thought of the ancient equipment she had used in Tunisia, which required multiple attempts to produce even marginally useful images, wasting precious film in the process. "Dr. Weinstein," she ventured, choosing her words carefully, "may I ask you something about American medical logistics?" He nodded, attention still on the X-rays. "Of course, Nurse Hoffman. How is any of this sustainable?" "The medications, the equipment, the supplies, the sheer volume of resources you dedicate to each patient. In our system, such expenditure would be impossible. We would run out within weeks." Weinstein removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "It's a reasonable question. The answer has several components. First, industrial capacity. America's manufacturing base is enormous, and crucially, it's been untouched by bombing. We can produce medications, equipment, supplies at scales that are difficult to comprehend until you see the factories themselves." He pulled out a folder from his desk containing what appeared to be production statistics. "Penicillin provides a useful example. In 1943, the entire United States produced approximately 21 billion units. By last year, 1944, we produced 1.6 trillion units. This year's projections suggest we'll reach 6.8 trillion units. The numbers were almost meaningless in their magnitude. Greta tried to contextualize them but failed. She had spent 2 years in the German medical corps treating patients who died of bacterial infections, while she had perhaps a handful of sulfa tablets to distribute among dozens of wounded men. The idea that medicine could exist in such quantities seemed to violate fundamental laws of scarcity. "Second," Weinstein continued, "there's the philosophical commitment. The United States military has made a policy decision that medical care is not a scarce resource to be rationed, but rather an investment in human life. Every dollar spent on medicine is considered worthwhile if it saves a soldier or even a prisoner. The Geneva Convention provides legal framework, but the American commitment exceeds those minimum requirements." Elsie, who had been quietly listening from across the ward, interjected, "But surely there must be some limit? Some point at which you say, 'This is too expensive, we cannot afford it'?" Weinstein smiled, though there was sadness in it. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But I've been in this system for 12 years now, since I arrived from Vienna, and I've yet to see a treatment denied on cost grounds alone. If it's medically indicated and technically feasible, it's considered justified." May 1945 brought news that reverberated through Camp Papago Park with seismic force. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Greta learned of it during morning rounds, when a patient listening to a radio broadcast suddenly began weeping. The sound drew everyone's attention. Prisoners, nurses, doctors, all clustered around the small radio as the announcer's voice detailed the unconditional surrender signed in Reims. The emotional response among the German prisoners was complex and contradictory, relief mingled with grief. Gratitude for survival mixed with despair at defeat. Some men wept openly, others maintained stoic silence. A few actually seemed pleased that the killing had finally stopped. Greta felt numb, her mind struggling to process what this meant for her future, her country, her profession. But the medical work continued. War's end did not erase wounds already inflicted. In the days following the surrender, Camp Papago Park received a large transfer of German POWs from East Coast facilities men captured during the Battle of the Bulge, during the final desperate fighting in the Rhineland, during the collapse of the Third Reich. Many carried wounds both physical and psychological that would require months or years of treatment. One transfer case particularly affected Marguerite. A lieutenant named Werner Schultz arrived with severe facial injuries sustained during the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest in February. American field surgeons had performed emergency procedures that saved his life, but the damage was extensive: shattered maxilla and mandible, destroyed right eye, severe scarring from burns. In the chaos of the European campaign's final weeks, he had been stabilized but not definitively treated. Now, at Camp Papago Park, American doctors proposed a series of reconstructive surgeries. Dr. Morrison outlined the treatment plan to Marguerite, who would assist. We'll need perhaps 6 to 8 procedures over the next year. Bone grafts to rebuild the facial structure, dental reconstruction, prosthetic eye fitting, soft tissue revision to minimize scarring. It's complex work, but we have a maxillofacial specialist coming from Walter Reed Hospital to supervise. Marguerite stared at him. A year? 8 procedures? For reconstruction? The war is over. He's a prisoner. Morrison's expression was patient. He's a human being who suffered catastrophic injuries. The war being over doesn't change our responsibility to provide care. The exchange crystallized something that had been building in Marguerite since her arrival. How? She demanded, her voice rising with uncharacteristic emotion. How can you afford this kindness? My country, we bombed your cities, we killed your soldiers, we started this entire nightmare, and you respond by rebuilding our faces? By saving our lives with your miraculous medicines? How can you justify such generosity to people who showed you none? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Because if we respond to cruelty with cruelty, if we meet barbarism with barbarism, then what exactly were we fighting for? The moral difference between us and our enemies has to be demonstrated through our actions, especially our actions toward those who can no longer harm us. He gestured toward the ward, where dozens of German prisoners received treatment that would have been unimaginable in German facilities. Every one of these men will go home eventually. They'll return to Germany and rebuild. What they tell their families and neighbors about their treatment here will matter. It will shape how the next generation thinks about America, about democracy, about the possibility of reconciliation. The first reconstructive surgery on Lieutenant Schultz occurred in mid-May 1945. Greta and Marguerite assisted, watching as American surgeons carefully rebuilt the lieutenant's shattered face with a combination of bone grafts, wire reconstruction, and meticulous soft tissue repair. The procedure took 11 hours. The level of surgical precision was extraordinary. These doctors were essentially sculpting a new face from the ruins of the old one. In the recovery room afterward, Schultz remained unconscious from anesthesia. Marguerite sat beside his bed, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting his foredrip, and wrestling with contradictions she could no longer reconcile. She thought of the medical philosophy she had been trained in: efficiency, triage, resource conservation. She thought of the patients she had been forced to categorize as nicht lebenswürdig, not worthy of life, according to the brutal calculus of Nazi medical ethics. And she thought of these American doctors who performed 11-hour reconstructive surgeries on enemy prisoners because, as Morrison had said, he's a human being who suffered catastrophic injuries. June 1945 arrived with temperatures that made the Arizona desert shimmer like liquid glass, but Greta hardly noticed the heat. She had been assigned to accompany a group of severely wounded German posts who were being transferred to a specialized rehabilitation facility in New Mexico. The journey would take 2 days by medical train itself, another marvel of American logistical capacity, and would provide Greta with her first extended exposure to American civilian society. The medical train was a revelation. Converted Pullman cars had been transformed into mobile hospital wards, complete with examination rooms, a surgical bay for emergencies, pharmacy storage, and sleeping quarters for medical staff. Air conditioning kept the interior comfortable despite the desert heat. Each patient had an assigned bed with fresh linens, monitoring equipment, and individualized care plans. Greta thought of the hospital trains she had worked on in Russia and heated freight cars where the wounded lay on straw, where the only mercy was that the cold temperatures slowed bleeding and reduced infection. During the journey, Greta found herself in conversation with an American doctor named Lieutenant Colonel James Ashford, a career military physician who had served in the Pacific Theater before transferring to POW medical operations. Ashford was a contemplative man in his 40s, with graying temples and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much death. "You seem troubled, Nurse Hoffman," he observed during a quiet moment as the train rolled through New Mexico's desert landscape. "More than just the usual adjustment difficulties." Greta considered her words carefully. "I'm trying to understand something, Colonel. My country lost the war because, among many reasons, we couldn't match Allied industrial production. We ran out of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, medical supplies, everything. But we were told this was because Germany was fighting the entire world, that we were outnumbered and surrounded." She paused, watching the landscape slide past. "But now I see American medicine, American logistics, American abundance, and I realize we were never just outnumbered. We were outproduced by such an enormous margin that the war was perhaps unwinnable from the start. My question is, if America possessed such overwhelming advantage, why did the war need to last 6 years? Why so much death if the outcome was inevitable?" Ashford sighed deeply. "That's a question many of us ask ourselves. The honest answer is complicated and unsatisfying. Partly it's that wars have momentum that's difficult to arrest. Partly it's that your leadership preferred national suicide to surrender. And partly ... He hesitated. "Partly it's that democracies are slow to mobilize. Our industrial capacity in 1945 existed because the war forced its creation, not before it." He pulled out a worn notebook, flipping through pages of statistics he had apparently been collecting. In 1939, America produced approximately 2,000 military aircraft. In 1944, we produced over 96,000. The pharmaceutical industry underwent similar expansion. The medical supply chain was essentially created from scratch. The capacity you see now didn't exist at the war's beginning. Greta absorbed this, her mind racing through implications. So the question becomes, why not maintain such capacity in peacetime? If you can produce 96,000 aircraft during war, why produce only 2,000 before it? "Because democracies don't maintain war economies in peacetime," Ashford replied. "We have elections, competing interests, people who reasonably argue that resources should go to schools and roads rather than weapons. Authoritarian regimes can command total mobilization constantly, but they exhaust themselves doing so. Democracies mobilize slowly, but once mobilized, can outproduce any authoritarian state precisely because our systems are more efficient and our people are more invested in the outcome." The conversation was interrupted by an emergency. One of the patients, a corporal with abdominal wounds, developed signs of internal bleeding. The train's medical team responded immediately, establishing intravenous access, administering blood transfusions, preparing for potential emergency surgery if the bleeding couldn't be controlled medically. Greta assisted, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, but part of her mind continued processing the conversation with Ashford. The patient stabilized after several tense hours. The bleeding had been contained through medical management, avoiding the need for surgery. As Greta cleaned up afterward, she overheard 2 American medics discussing the case. "Close call," one said. "Good thing we had the O negative on hand. 6 units, the other replied. "That's like half a month's supply back in 42. Now we carry it standard on every medical train. 6 units had been half a month's supply just 3 years ago. Now it was considered standard emergency stock on a single train." The rate of change was almost inconceivable. August 1945 brought news of Japan's surrender, and with it the definitive end of World War II. Greta stood in the courtyard of Camp Papago Park as prisoners and guards alike listened to President Truman's announcement. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally, conclusively over. Around her, men wept, prayed, stared silently at the desert sky, each processing the moment in their own way. But for Greta and the other German medical personnel, the end of combat brought new challenges that would prove, in some ways, more difficult than the physical.